20-minute opening statement.
Great. Okay. Well, I wish I could go right into the rebuttal, but we're going to have to do this first. So let's go right into it, and let's show you what and who this Muhammad is of the 7th century versus the Muhammad of the 9th and 10th century. So now David has given a very convincing view of this Muhammad of the 9th and 10th century. What he didn't want to talk to you about is this timeline. Take a look at the timeline, you'll see the problem. Everything that he referred to, all those stories that he talked about, the 10 different problems, do not take place or are not written down, are not at all, you might say, even put to any historical evidence that we can see at the time, even the century that he lived. Take a look and see where the names are. And there's the story of Muhammad, born 570. He went through that. And now let's see where all that takes place. Take a look at this slide here. The material that he talks about, everything that he's dependent on for his paradigm, does not come until Ibn Hisham. You notice I have an Ibn Ishaq up there, but I've kind of put him in a very shadowed form. The reason why is I don't think any of the material that we use today on Muhammad comes from Ibn Ishaq. We don't know anything about Ibn Ishaq. It's only attributed to Ibn Ishaq. Everything we know comes from Ibn Hisham. Look at his dates. He doesn't even begin to appear until the 9th century. Muhammad died in 632. I'm getting an echo here. Is that important or not? Can you still hear me all right? Okay. So here you have Ibn Hisham. 833 is when that first biography of Muhammad is written down. That's 200 years after the fact. Al-Waqidi comes after that. When is the first traditions on concerning his speech? That doesn't come until Al-Bukhari. Look at the dates, 870. Sahih Muslim, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Ibn Dawud, and Nisa. That's all up until 915, going into the 10th century. And we have nothing about the Tafsir or the Tahriq until Al-Tari, 923. So we're looking at 200 to 300 years later, this is all written down. Regardless of whether it's disturbing or embarrassing, we'll get to that in the rebuttal. Just look at the timeline. And notice where all these writers are from. They're all from those red dots. But everything that he has been talking about take place in the green dots. You notice that? Can you see the north-south problem here? Everything about this Muhammad from the 9th century is supposedly taking place in Mecca and Medina, in the Hijaz, the central part of Arabia. All the writing about him, everything that's written about him, takes place in Cairo, Baghdad, Tabaristan, Basra, and Bukhara. Hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years different. Therefore, none of the traditional writers lived or worked in Mecca or Medina. They were too far to the north of Mecca and came from the west and east of Baghdad. You can look at the kilometers. I won't get into that. By the way, all of these slides, if you want them, I can give them to you. Not for those of you who are watching, those of you who are here who bought tickets, okay?
One of the biggest clowns to comment on Islam would be somebody named Jay Smith. So David Wood and Jay Smith were one of the biggest clowns and jokers when it comes to commenting on Islam, had a useless debate on whether Muhammad existed. Newsflash, Muhammad did exist. I mean, just go to Saudi Arabia, go to Medina, and you can see his grave, and open up the grave, and you can see him right there. So these clowns, I don't know, they just wasted their own time, but that's what they're good at, just wasting their time and wasting other people's time. But anyways, I wanna comment on what you just saw on that video. Basically, Jay Smith has been saying, hang on, let me just read what he says here. He says yada yada yada. He says the conclusion is that Bukhari, Al-Tabari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Ibn Hisham, etc., wrote their material, which is the Hadith and the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. They all wrote their material hundreds of miles too far and hundreds of miles, or I'm sorry, they all wrote their material, being the Hadith and the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, hundreds of miles too far and hundreds of years too late. So basically, he's saying that that Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Al-Tabari, they were never operating in Makkah and Medina, and they were they wrote their traditions outside of Mecca and Medina, from the west and east of Baghdad and Cairo, Egypt, etc., etc. So, and if you look at his timeline, I'm looking at his timeline right now. He says that Ibn Hisham was the earliest, or Ibn Ishaq was the earliest biographer. That's not true, but I'll get into that later. Then Ibn Hisham came, like about 200 years later, and then Bukhari came 200 years later. Al-Tabari came about 300 years later, according to him. Uh, so he basically says Muhammad lived at 632, and then we hear of the first biography of Prophet Muhammad in 765, which is about like 100 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, and then we get to the Hadith at least 200 years after, et cetera, et cetera. So is this true? Is this statement that he just said, is it true or is it false? Now this statement is false, and um, I'm going to be explaining why it's false. Basically, Jay Smith didn't do any kind of research on this. He didn't do any kind of proper research because even if you read, okay, so I have, let's just go into the Hadith real quick. I have this book right here. It's called Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature. So I'm going to be posting an Amazon link in the bottom. This book is, I believe, it's about $12 on Amazon. So if you don't have this book, buy this book. Don't try to be a cheap ass and don't try to be a Jew and try to like get a free PDF off the internet. No, just buy this book, right? This book is actually very important to learn about how the hadith were collected and who wrote the hadith, etc. Mustafa al-Azami shows that the hadith were written by people who knew the Prophet Muhammad, who lived with the Prophet Muhammad, and were taught directly by the Prophet Muhammad. This claim that the hadith came 200 or 300 years later, came 200 or 300 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad is false. For example, we have people like Ibn Abbas who wrote down multiple hadith books. This is found in Ibn Sa'd's Tabagat al-Kabar, volume 5, page 293. We have the manuscript of Abdullah ibn Masud, et cetera, et cetera. So these disciples or companions of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down hadith. So that refutes the claim that the hadith came 200 years later. The hadith did not come 200 years later. The hadith were written during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Um, you know, hang on one second. So basically, and then there's another book. It's called Studies in Early Hadith Literature, where Dr. Mustafa Al-Azami states that on pages 34 to 60 mentions the names of 50 disciples or companions of the Prophet Muhammad who wrote down Hadith. Then from pages 60 to 74, he mentions the names of 49 successors from the first Islamic century that wrote down Hadith. Then from page 74 to page 106, he mentions the names of 87 scholars who wrote down Hadith from the late first and early second centuries after Hijrah. Then he mentions on page 106 to 182, he mentions the names of 251 scholars from the early second century who wrote down Hadith. So before Bukhari was even born, there were people writing down and circulating Hadiths in the first 200 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So basically, we have, before Bukhari, there were books like the books of the script of Haman ibn Muhaim, et cetera, et cetera. So these people were writing, these companions or disciples of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad were writing down hadith way earlier than Bukhari. The strongest evidence for this is Shafi of Haman ibn Muhaim, and I'm going to be posting a link below where Islamic-awareness, Islamic-awareness.org has that information about this early Muslim scholar who wrote down hadith from the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad. So we have a chain of transmission. The disciples of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down Hadith, and then the disciples of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down Hadith, and then they passed their books in the first two generations. So that's how, and this was way before Bukhari was even born. So basically, if we read this book, Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature, if we go to page, hang on one second. If we go to page 74 of this book, some might ask, how come, where are these early first century hadith works written by the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad and, the first two generations of these, all these books and booklets, these hundreds of books and booklets that were circulating? What happened? Basically, this is what Mustafa al-Azami says. He says, I have mentioned earlier that hundreds and thousands of hadith were in circulations in the first and second century. And again, keep in mind that these hadith books and booklets were written by the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad in the next generation after the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, the second generation of Muslims, of early Muslims. So he says, I mentioned earlier that hundreds and thousands of books of hadith were in circulation in the first and second century. Only a very small amount of this hadith literature has survived. It could be said that either what I've described is totally wrong, or these books were in existence at some time but were lost later. The second hypothesis raises another problem: the negligence of the hadith of the Prophet by Muslim scholars. It is possible that they did not feel the necessity of hadith literature, and so it was destroyed. As a matter of fact, my position is precise and correct. These books, and this is the important part, these books were not destroyed, nor did they perish, but they were absorbed into the work of later authors. When the encyclopedia type books were produced, scholars did not feel the necessity to keep the early books or booklets, and so slowly they disappeared. To explain this point, I have described the methodology of quotations in the early days, which would prove my point. So basically, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Abu Dawud, they absorbed these early hadith books written by the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad in the second generation into their works. Bukhari absorbed, what Ibn Abbas's books and Abdullah bin Masud's hadith books, these immediate disciples of Prophet Muhammad. He absorbed it into his work. So that refutes the idea that the hadith came 200 years later. So basically, J. Smith is a revisionist. He's one of those morons that'll deny the Holocaust, even when you provide him evidence to support the Holocaust or the World War II. What happened in World War II? He'll deny it. So these people, these Christian apologists just keep getting stupider and stupider and stupider as time goes on. When they come to critiquing or commenting on Islam. Another good book to study how the Hadith were formed and the early preservation of the Hadith would be this book, The History of the Quranic Text from Revelation to Compilation by Mustafa al-Azami. So not only does it show early Quranic manuscripts that go back at least 50 to 70 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad, and these early manuscripts are actually uniform with today's Quranic manuscripts, but he goes into Hadith a little bit too. He doesn't go into Hadith that much. This is a book mainly explaining the preservation of the Quran over the preservation of the Bible, but or manuscripts of the Quran versus manuscripts of the Bible. But on page 167 to 168, from pages 167 to 169, he says that he gives hadith and how the hadith were preserved by the generations by by generations of Muslims that go back to the companions or the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad. He goes into how the Hadith were preserved. Then hang on. Then he goes on to explain, um, you know, uh, he goes on to explain how the Hadith were studied and how the Hadith were preserved from the Prophet to one of to the from the Prophet to one of the companions of the Prophet to a student of the Prophet. Uh, you know, and then he goes into he gives here's the first one two. He goes into the first three generation how the hadith were compiled. So it goes to the Prophet Muhammad, then people like Abu Huraira, Aisha, Anas, Abu Musa, all these companions of the Prophet Muhammad and wives of the Prophet Muhammad. They learned from the Prophet, and the companions of the Prophet Muhammad who knew how to write wrote down his hadith, and then they passed it on from the first generation to the second generation to the third generation, and then Bukhari and then people like Bukhari, etc., absorb those early hadith books from the first two generations. So this is a pretty good book to get. So Mustafa al Azami is one of the he was one of the scholars when it came to early hadith, and he refuted the claims of the Orientalists, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, well, I have this book, which is like this is like David Wood and Jay Smith's like favorite book on Islam, The Life of Muhammad by Sirat Rasulullah by Ibn Asaq, translated by Alfred Guillaume. Now, before this book starts with the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, this person talks about Alfred Guillaume talks about a little bit about the history of the biography of the sira of the Prophet Muhammad, and basically, on page 16 of this book, he says that Ibn Ishaq was not the earliest biography of the Prophet Muhammad. Basically, somebody named Urwa bin Zubair bin al-Awam, who was a cousin of the Prophet, was one of the first people to write the early history of Islam. And he says that Urwa was recognized as an authority on early Islam, and the Umayyad Caliph Abu Malik applied to him when he needed information on that subject. Then he says that many traditions that are handed down in his name by Ibn Ishaq and other writers justify the assertion that he was the founder of Islamic history. So the founder of Islamic history was not Ibn Ishaq. It was Urwa bin Zubair bin al-Awam, a cousin of the Prophet. So one of the disciples or the companions of the Prophet, an eyewitness to the Prophet Muhammad's ministry, wrote down the early biography or the early sira or the early biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And then so then there was another person. There were other early biographers like Suwayd bin Sa'ad, and Mustafa, or I'm sorry, Musa bin Uqba, who reported traditions from some of the Prophet's companions. Then there was Asim bin Umair. So all these like early Muslim scholars wrote down the biography or wrote down the hadith or wrote down the biography of the Prophet Muhammad according to this book, The Life of Muhammad. Further on, I don't know, like eight 8 or 9 years ago, I wrote an article on Ibn Ishaq, and because some people even before this whole nonsensical debate happened between David Wood and Jay Smith, someone named uh, Samuel Green was saying that the biography of the Prophet Muhammad didn't happen or wasn't written until 120 years after the death of the Prophet, and this is false beyond. This is completely false. Uh, you know, uh, a lot of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down the Hadith or wrote down, the Maghazi, or they wrote down the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. People like Orway bin Zubair, like I said, people like Abdullah Fida, Malik Ansari, and this person was before Ibn Ishaq, Aban ibn Uthman ibn Affan, so the son of one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, Uthman, transmitted material, and then we had people like Amr bin Suwaid al Shabi, so basically, and people like Sa ibn Abi Hatim, who was a young disciple or a young companion of the Prophet Muhammad, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, according to Western scholarship, according to scholarship done on the biography or the formation of the biography of Prophet Muhammad, according to people like Raven Wim in his book Sira in the Quran, pages 29 to 49. People like Fred Donner, etc., and R. Ahmad in his book Al Sira Al Nawawi, which was published in Saudi Arabia, and Alfred Guillaume, etc. According to these people, right, these academics, these Muslim and non-Muslim academics, they basically did really good research, and they found that the early Muslims who knew the Prophet Muhammad and lived with the Prophet Muhammad wrote down his biography and passed it on from one generation to the other generation to the generation of Ibn Ishaq, and that's when Ibn Ishaq started collecting and writing his material down. So, but the unfortunate part is we don't have these early we don't have these early written works by people like Musa bin Akbal, Arwa, etc. We don't have those works anymore. They were either lost or destroyed as time went on. Another good book is this book, The Early Sources for the Prophet Muhammad's Biography, right here. So I got this book a few years ago, and basically this author is Dr. Muhammad Saeed Mikwal El Rahwan, who is a PhD in Hadith sciences, and he's also a assistant professor of Hadith at Al Azhar University in Egypt. So basically, he says that we have early biography material for the Prophet Muhammad. So basically, he goes on. He talks about on page 55 of this book. He says that the works of Arway bin al Zubair and al Zuri and Musa ibn Akbal, their works no longer exist in their original form. And of course, these people were before Ibn Ishaq, al-Tabari, etc. And then he goes on page. I'm trying to keep this video short, so I can't really get into it. But he goes on to cite early biography sources about the Prophet Muhammad in the first two Islamic centuries. On pages 77 to 122. Then he talks about origin of the early biography sources of the life of the Prophet Muhammad on page 125 to 153. Then he talks about how early biography sources of the Prophet Muhammad's life on pages 25 to 51, etc., etc. So let me just read some parts of the book. Um, so he goes into like Orientalists and he refutes the Orientalist claims that, the Orientalist claims are the same what J. Smith is saying today, that, there was no early Hadith and there was no early biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and the material for Islam came 200 to 300 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, which is all false, which I just said. So he basically said that the original versions were spread by Urwa, who was the cousin or companion of the Prophet Muhammad, would be reconstructed by comparing those transmitted by his son Hisham to those transmitted through Al-Zuhair, et cetera, et cetera. So um, even these Orientalists admit that Urwa bin Zubair was the one who collected major Hadith collections as well as historical works. Uh, you know, uh, so basically, these even these Orientalists or even these non-Muslim Western academics admit that Urwa bin al-Zubair, who was one of the disciples or the cousin of the Prophet, an eyewitness of the Prophet Muhammad's ministry, wrote down and preserved the Hadith and biography traditions, and these works were later on absorbed by later people like Ibn Ishaq, etc., Al-Tabari, etc., etc. So basically, this is further proof that these people like David Wood and Jay Smith, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. So, anyways, the books to get to refute this claim or to study the biography and the preservation of the biography and Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad would be this book, The History of the Quranic Text from Revelation to Compilation. Then get this book. It's called The Studies in Hadith, Methodology and Literature. Then get this book, Early Sources for Prophet Muhammad's Biography. And of course, get this book too, even though this book isn't really that much reliable. It's called The Life of Muhammad, translation by of Ibn Ishaq Sirat Rasulullah by Alfred Guillaume. And if your cheap Jewish ass doesn't want to pay the money to get these books on Amazon, I'm sure you can find some PDF format of these books. I'm sure it's out there on the internet. If you dig on the internet, you can find anything on the internet. So, those would be the books I would recommend. So I hope this refutes the idea that there was no early Hadith or there was no early biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. As for the Prophet Muhammad's existence, let me just get into that really quickly. We have documents that that mention the Prophet Muhammad at least 2 years after the death of Muhammad. For example, we have hang on, I'm trying to get into. So basically, like the earliest mention of Muhammad comes from Greek, Syriac, Armenian, and Hebrew sources, which are dated after 633 CE. Hang on, let me just get into it real quickly. We have hang on, let me just find the quote so I can just read it real quick. There's basically the Arab conquest of Syria, which mentions Muhammad, and this was written around 636. So this was at least 2 or 3 years after the death of Muhammad. So basically, according to the Islamic-awareness.org website, they document there were at least 4 different mentions of the Prophet Muhammad by secular or Christian sources, or in other words, non-Muslim sources. The first was Dr. Yaqubi Nopur Jaspir in 634 to 640 CE. Basically, it talks about this document says, "What can you tell me about the prophet who has appeared with the Saracens?" He basically says Prophet Muhammad is a false prophet because prophets do not come armed with a sword. And this is this is one of the very earliest non-Islamic sources to mention the Prophet Muhammad, and this was recorded in 637 CE, which is about like a year or at least 2 to 3 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. Then we have the record of the Arab conquest of Syria in 15 to 16 AH, or 637 CE, where it talks about the Arabs of Muhammad. Um, you know, and this was written in 636 CE. About 2 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. Um, and then we have Thomas the Parisine, 640. So he says that he talks about the Arabs of Muhammad, in the conquest of Syria. He says that there was a battle between the Romans and the Arabs of Muhammad in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. Uh, you know, and so this means that the time period between the death of Muhammad and the earliest mention of him is only a year and a half. And then there's other sources like Sias, the bishop of Bagorius. He wrote in 660s. And then he says that at that time, a certain man from among the sons of Ishmael, whose name was Muhammad. So basically, he basically says that the Arabs are the sons of Ishmael, and Muhammad, he says Muhammad is a prophet. Um, and this was written at least a few years, maybe 10 years after the death of Muhammad. And then we have the Chronicle of Kazakhstan in 660s. He says, then God raised up amongst them the sons of Ishmael, whose leader was Muhammad. Um, Basically, he says that Muhammad was the leader of the sons of Ishmael, whom God raised against the Persians. Then in 665 CE, it talks about this anonymous author, who is probably a Marcionite Christian, talks about Muhammad in 665 CE. So basically, and then there's John Bar Pancon in 687. He talks about the traditions of Muhammad. So these are basically early mentions of Muhammad. That mention that these are non-Islamic or non-Muslim sources, Christian sources. It's Christian and secular sources that talk about the Prophet Muhammad. Um, a few years after the Prophet Muhammad died, at least 3 to 6 years, 3 to 10 years after the death of Muhammad, these Christian and secular writers were writing, yeah, there was a man named Muhammad. He claimed to be a prophet. He was among the sons of Ishmael. He was a leader of the Arabs, etc., etc. So we have early mentions of the Prophet Muhammad. Compare this with Jesus. We don't have anything outside the New Testament that mention him. Josephus has been proven to be a forgery, and Tacitus was mentioning Jesus, but Tacitus didn't do any kind of fact checking. He doesn't name his sources. So the historical sources for the historical sources documenting the Prophet Muhammad are better than the sources we have for Jesus or any other religious figure for that matter. So the history of Muhammad and the history of Islam has been accurately preserved from the first two generations. From the first generation, which would be the disciples of Prophet Muhammad, they did their best to preserve the Hadith and the biography, and they pass it on to the second generation. And then the third generation, being Bukhari, Al-Tabari, Ibn Hisham, they recorded these early traditions, and Ibn Ishaq, of course, recorded earlier traditions, whether written or oral traditions, into his book. But in his book is the one that survived over Musa bin Uqba, Urwa, etc., etc. So Ibn Ishaq's book was preserved, while these early hadith or these early biography and hadith books weren't preserved for whatever reason, whatever reason that there was. So basically, basically the history of Islam is preserved, and this nonsense by Jay Smith should stop. But whatever, the Circus Act must continue. So David and Jay Smith must continue their Circus Act, and they're doing so, and they're wasting their time. Let them waste their time. Why should we Muslims give a shit? So basically, this concludes this video. Stay tuned. The final videos are coming up.